things a little bit different today. Bear with me.
Come on, bless him, Lord.
First thing I want to do is read Scripture this morning. The well that Jacob had dug was still there. And Jesus sat down beside it because he was tired from traveling. It was noon. And after Jesus' disciples had gone into town to buy some food, a Samaritan woman came to draw water from the well. Jesus asked her, "Would you please give me a drink of water?" "You're a Jew," she replied, "and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink of water when Jews and Samaritans won't have anything to do with each other?" Jesus answered, "You don't know what God wants to give you, and you don't know who He is asking you for a drink. If you did, you would ask for the water that gives life." I'm going to give you a little bit of background information this morning. Before David became the king of Israel, there were 12 tribes of Israel, and they were just scattered, separated. Every tribe looked after themselves. When David became king, the 12 tribes united under one kingdom, and David was the king, and they became a very powerful nation. When David died, his son Solomon became king, and the nation prospered even more, and it grew stronger and stronger and stronger. 12 tribes united into one, the nation of Israel. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam was not a very smart nor a very strong man. When he took the kingdom, the 10 tribes from the north rebelled because he wouldn't reduce their taxes. And because of that rebellion, there was always friction between the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. The kingdom of Samaria, the 10 tribes that went to the north, become very evil and very wicked. Their capital was Samaria. That's where they lived. And the Jews lived in Jerusalem. As time went on, they become more wicked and more wicked. And the Babylonians come, and the Assyrians, and they captured them and took them away captive. And they were later returned to their country, but they sent some Babylonians with them. And they begin to intermarry, and they become, according to the Jews, impure, unholy. They wasn't God's people anymore in the Jews' opinion, because they had intermarried with Babylonians. And they were Samaritans, and the Jews wouldn't let them come into Jerusalem and worship in the temple, so they built their own place of worship up on the mountain. And that's where they worshiped God. Now that's a little bit of background information on where this woman was coming from. She's coming from Samaria. She was not socially or religiously accepted by the Jews. And Jesus has walked through Samaria, and it's not just a chance walking through. He's going with a purpose. He has a purpose for being at that well at that time, which was noon. And there's a woman coming, and that's his purpose for being there. It was not a chance encounter. And this woman coming to the well at noon was not a normal thing to happen, really. The women come earlier in the morning, and they all come together for protection. And here this woman's got her water jug or pitcher, and she's coming to the well at noon by herself. That's out of the norm, because she was an outcast. She wasn't acceptable by all the other women in Samaria. Maybe they were afraid that she'd steal their husband. I don't know, but they didn't associate with her. And this woman, as she was coming, she's coming with a past. She's got a lot of baggage. The Bible says she had been married 5 times, divorced 5 times, and was shacking up with a guy now. She was not a real, what we'd call, holy woman. But she's coming, and she's coming to the well, and she's walking down that dusty road, and she looks up and she sees a man sitting there. I'm sure she's a little bit skittish. I'm sure she's afraid to be alone with this man. Then she looks at his clothing, and she realized, hey, that's a Jew. He ain't going to have nothing to do with me. He'd be unclean if he touched me. So she goes ahead and she begins to draw the water. And Jesus said, would you please give me some water? And she said, you, a Jew, are asking me, a Samaritan woman, that I would give you water? Don't you know that if I even touch the vessel you'll drink from, you'll be unclean? But he said, if you knew who you was talking to, I would give you living water, something that would make you never thirst again. And that woman, she had a hole in her heart. She had an empty place in there. She wanted something that she didn't have. She tried to fill that hole up with relationships with people. 5 men, divorces, and now another man. But he couldn't fill the hole. The only thing that could fill that hole was a relationship with Jesus Christ. Now this woman, she was very stubborn religiously. She was a Samaritan. She worshipped in Samaria. They believed in the first 5 books of the Word. That's all she believed, the first 5 books of Moses. Sort of like Sadducees. All she knew, she didn't know anything about grace. She knew about the law. She was under the law and very strict in it. And she sort of wanted to argue with Jesus. And she knew something about prophecy. Because she said, the Messiah is coming. And he said, hey, I am the Messiah. She accepted him. Her life was changed. Not only did she get saved that day, but she ran into the town and said, come see this man that told me everything that I've ever done. Isn't this the Messiah? See, when we have an encounter with God, our life changes. Now I'm going to take a few minutes and talk to you about another woman. And I want to talk to you about another well. There was a woman, and we want to call her Sally, because Sally's just a good name as any. Sally was sort of an outcast. She was a loner. Sally lived outside of town in the forest. And Sally was what we call living off the grid. She didn't have electricity. She lived by herself. And she was self-sufficient. She had built her a cabin, Miriam, out of logs by herself. Didn't have any help. It's like the old log cabins we used to build. She had chinked it and stuffed the cracks. And she was very, very, very self-sufficient. She had put a wooden door up that bolted from the inside that nobody could get in. She had put wooden shutters, big, thick oak shutters on the windows from the inside that nobody could get in. She didn't want to be around people. She had been hurt by people. She didn't like people. She grew her own food. She had a beautiful garden. She raised her own chickens and livestock. She had dug her own well, and it was a deep well. And she didn't need hardly anything at all. When she needed to go to town, she'd go to get some sugar or some salt or some oil for her lamp. She didn't have electricity. And that's why she would go to town. But other than that, she wanted to stay home, work in the garden, and not see people. She didn't like people. And when she became lonely, when she needed some romance in her life, she would slip into town, go into a movie theater, sit on the back row, and watch them dark and handsome movie stars that was on the big screen. That was her romance, Miriam. And she would go home and she'd fantasize about them tall, dark movie stars all day long and work in her garden. She could see it so clear. There was a little lane that come up to her house, and she could almost see. Here come this big, tall, dark stranger riding up on a big white horse and rescuing her. She could see things like that. Well, she would continually work in her garden, and she was so proud of her garden. One day as she was working at the garden, she looked over at the well, and there was a bucket hanging on the well there. She could tell that a knot hole had popped out of the wood, and she knew she had to plug that knot hole in the wood so it would hold water. Now on her bucket, it was about that big around. It had about 4 foot of chain hooked onto the bucket, and then the rope went into the chain up into a crank. That's how she would lower the bucket down or raise it up. She thought, well, I need to fix my bucket. So she lets that crank down so she can pull the bucket over to the side of the well and locks the crank in place. And she reaches for the chain on the bucket, and she slips, and she falls in the well. Now she's holding on to that chain. That's the only thing between her and sudden death, because it's so far down to the bottom of the well, she knows that she would perish. She's holding on with both hands. There's nobody to come help her. All of a sudden there's a shadow that comes across the top of the well, and there's a man there. That man reaches his hand down into the well, wraps that chain around his arms, and he says, hold on, I'll pull you up. And he begins to slowly pull it up. It had all of her weight, and he's pulling it with his one arm. And that chain begins to cut into his arm, Miriam. And it breaks the flesh, and blood begins to stream down his arm. And that blood streams down, it hits her on the top of the head, it comes down her face. It even falls down in a well. And he gets her up to where he can get his other arm around her, and he pulls her over, and he gets her out of the well. And she's sitting there at the bottom of the well looking up at him and says, he ain't dark, he ain't handsome, he ain't tall, but boy, he sure got a pretty smile. So she smiles back at him. And he said, will it be all right if I come by tomorrow and talk to you? And she said, it'd be great. So he comes back tomorrow and they talk, and man, they begin to enjoy each other's company so much. There's so much excitement. And after about a month of this, he pops the big question, will you marry me? She says yes. They go into the town and they get married and they come back. And let me tell you, it's a great honeymoon. Oh, it's so great. It's so fulfilling. They work together in the garden. And in the evening, they have communication. They talk and they cuddle. And man, everything is so good. And this goes on for about 6 months. And after about 6 months, she returns to her lonely ways. He still goes out and helps her in the garden. But when evening comes, she no longer wants to cuddle or communicate. She wants to sit there and read a book. And just sort of ignores him. After about 3 weeks, she decides, I really don't need you helping me in the garden. So he says, well, I'll tell you what. My property, it adjoins your property. I will go to my property while you work in the garden all day, and I'll be building us a new house to live in. So every day he would go to his property and work on a new house, and she'd stay there in the garden. And he would come home at night looking for companionship and talk and communication, and all she wanted to do was read a book. The only time she tried to communicate with him is when something went wrong, when there was a wreck or a problem she couldn't handle, and he would give her advice, but she really wouldn't take his advice. So they went through life for years like that. And the only reason she really even succeeded at anything is when she'd done something, he would come behind her and fix it right where she had fixed it wrong and never say anything. And that's the kind of life they lived. Sort of no communication. Sort of not very good. As time went on and they grew older. One day she was in the garden and he was over working on the house and she could hear a horse, David, coming down the lane. She looked and wow, there was that white horse. And there was that tall, dark stranger on that white horse. And he's riding straight up to her. He stretches down his arm just like she had seen and daydreamed so many times. And she looked into his eyes and she realized that was her husband. But he had never looked like that in her eyes before. She had never seen him as handsome. She had taken him for granted for so long. He picked her up and swung her up on the horse and they rode over to his property. And as they rode into the yard, there was the most beautiful house that she'd ever laid her eyes on. It was beyond description. It was beautiful, beautiful house. He got her off the horse and he picks her up and he carries her through the threshold, David. And when they got inside, man, the walls, they just shined. It was so beautiful. The floor looked like it was made out of pure gold. Everything was so good. And her heart began to burn because she thought about all the times that she had ignored him. She thought about all the times that he wanted to communicate and she wanted to read a book. So she fell down on her knees and she asked him to forgive her. He reached down his arm to pick her up and she looked and she saw the scars where that chain had cut into his arm when he had pulled her out of that well and saved her. Her heart was broken and she began to weep bitterly. Tears began to stream down. He reached up and he began to wipe the tears away. And he told her this: before I met you, my property adjoined your property. And I would watch you every day and I loved you so. When you fell in the well and I came and I pulled you out of the well, I loved you so much. When we got married, my heart was overwhelmed with love for you. And he said, now we'll live here forever and we'll always be happy. Today, the church worldwide is so much like that woman. So much like her. When we first get saved, we have that encounter with the Lord and our heart burns and we're so happy and we feel so good. And we can't wait to communicate with Him. We can't wait to read the Word. We can't wait to pray. We can't wait just to be in His presence. But after a while, just like Sally, we find other things to replace that. Maybe it's a book. Maybe it's Facebook. Maybe it's a computer. Maybe it's a job. Maybe it's anything. It don't matter. But we draw so far away. We just move so far away from where God is in our relationship. See, God wants a relationship with everybody in this building. He wants a real relationship with Him. Not a surface one, not one that's just high and by. But He wants you to dwell in His presence. He wants you to absorb the things that He has to say. This past few weeks for me, I've had a desire to be with the Lord. I've had a desire just to be in His presence. I wish that I could be on the Sea of Galilee. I wish that I could get in the boat with Him when He spoke to the waves and He calmed He raised the widow's son. I wish I could be there. I have that desire to be in His presence. But we as church people anymore, we just go through the emotions. And we're so hooked up on religion, we've left relationship out of the picture. It's about one thing in life, guys. Are you in relationship with Jesus? Does your heart burn when you think about Him? Is He what you are caring about? Is He the treasure of your heart? That's what it needs to be. We don't need to wait until He comes and takes us home to be in relationship. We can be in relationship right now. If we only would. Thought you'd right. We're going to sing this song. And if you'd like to work on your relationship with God, maybe it's just not what it needs to be. Maybe you're saved, but maybe you just don't feel that overwhelming touch of God around you. Maybe you just don't feel the love of the Lord in your life. Today's the day that all of that can change. See, it changed for that Samaritan woman when she came to the well. And she gave her heart to the Lord. It changed for Sally when she realized she had ignored her best friend. Think about it.
My sleep is gone, my heart is full of sorrow. I can't believe how much I've let you down. I dread the things that wait for me tomorrow, when the sun reveals my broken dreams lie scattered on the ground. Please forgive me. I need your grace to make it through. All I have is you. I'm at your mercy. I will serve you until my dying day. Help others find a way at your mercy. Please forgive me. Can't believe the God of earth and glory would care for a sinner like me. But I read the book about that same old story, how He died for my forgiveness when He hung on that old tree. Please forgive me. I need your grace to make it through. All I have is you. I'm at your mercy, and I will serve you until my dying day. Help others find a way at your mercy. Please forgive me.
Can we as a church body this morning say, please forgive me, Lord. I know I've failed you so many times and in so many ways. I know I've took our relationship for granted. I know I've not been what I need to be. But I'd like to start over this morning, Lord. I'd like you to take the slate and just erase it and make it clean, Lord. Can you say that this morning? Can you give your life to Him totally this morning? Can you say, oh Lord, I'm so sick and sorry of ignoring you. When you call me in the midnight hour, and I'm too busy to hear you. I'm too preoccupied preoccupied with junk, Lord. Can you say, please